And now, Daljit Dhaliwal.
Chad's ongoing conflict and the massive wave of refugees from Sudan's Darfur region and the Central African Republic have turned Chad into a humanitarian hotspot. Around 500,000 people, mostly from Darfur, are living in refugee camps inside Chad. Here to talk about her recent trip to some of those camps is Camilla Olsen of Refugees International. Camilla, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about the conditions and the resources in some of the camps that you actually managed to visit.
Well, there are about 12 refugee camps consisting of Darfuri refugees who've been in eastern Chad for about 5 years now. And so what we actually found was that the humanitarian situation, the sort of basic needs of the refugees are being met. And the request that many of the refugees were making to us when we spoke with them was for other kinds of assistance, for longer term assistance like education and access to livelihood programs.
And when you say that their basic needs have been met, does that also include safety?
There is definitely still an issue of insecurity in eastern Chad. In fact, we were there in early May, and when we arrived, Chadian rebels crossed into Chad from the Sudanese border, from the Sudanese side, and clashed with the Chadian military, which forced some humanitarians to relocate from where they were working near the camps. So this state of constant insecurity, the sense that rebels may attack at any time, makes a lot of the organizations feel like it's still an emergency situation. But in reality, in the camps, the level and the standards of assistance are still quite good. And so it's important now to start looking at moving beyond basic needs and looking at things like livelihoods and education.
But does that proxy war between Chad and Sudan have an impact on the sense of security and safety of the refugees? I mean, have there been attacks recently on any of the refugees in any of the 12 camps?
What's interesting is actually the rebels, the Chadian rebels don't tend to attack the camps. Their target is more the capital, and they're going after the Chadian president, Deby. But it does definitely create a sense of insecurity in general, and it makes it very difficult for the humanitarians to respond. The good thing is that there is a United Nations peacekeeping mission on the ground called MINURCAT. They took over from a European-led mission in mid-March, and they're still expanding their presence, but they're hoping that their extended reach and increased numbers of peacekeepers will contribute a bit to the safety in eastern Chad.
Let's talk a little bit about the resources. I mean, when you have something like 500,000 people, I mean, does that give sort of rise to tensions over local resources between the IDP camps, whether the local Chadians who have been displaced by the fighting inside Chad are living, and the Darfuri refugees and the refugees from the Central African Republic?
It is definitely a very big issue in Chad. Resources in general are limited. Access to water is one of the main issues, but also access to food. We visited a camp called Bahai, which is in the northern part of eastern Chad, and there the lack of resources has created tensions between the local people and the refugees. So refugee women told us when they go outside of the camp to look for firewood or to look for water, they're often attacked, and there's also been cases of rape in those instances. So definitely the resource constraints contribute to a sense of insecurity for the refugees. I think these protection concerns is why the UN peacekeeping mission is there on the ground, MINURCAT, and so it's their role to sort of provide area security for the refugees and also for the internally displaced Chadians. But again, they're only at about half of their capacity. So by the end of the year, they should have the complete number of peacekeepers that they've been mandated to have, and we're hoping that once they're on the ground, that this will improve some of these concerns like attacks against women and insecurity in the camps.
Would groups like Refugees International like to see the rapists being apprehended and being tried?
I think it's definitely important to deal with these issues of protection. The bigger problem in Chad, and this is something that MINURCAT is also dealing with, is just a problem of impunity. There's really no rule of law. There isn't really a judicial system in the East. And so that's also part of the focus and the mandate of MINURCAT is to improve the judicial capacity of the local Chadian government.
You had once before, I believe, tried to get in to see the refugees, but you didn't have any luck getting in, or were you trying to get into Sudan, I believe, to go and talk to Darfuris there?
Exactly. In December 2007, I went to Khartoum, and we were hoping to travel to Darfur to meet with the internally displaced Chadians there. And we spent about 3 weeks or so in Khartoum trying to get a travel permit. But I think because of the type of work that we do, because we publish reports and do advocacy here with the U.S. Congress and the administration, the Sudanese government wasn't too happy to grant us the permits. So we ended up just staying in Khartoum.
So the way to get through is through Chad.
Yeah.
rather than getting into the Darfur region of Sudan, because it's very difficult to get in to find out what's happening on the ground there. So when you went to the camps in eastern Chad, did you go with a specific mission?
Well, the focus of our trip was to look, for example, at how MINURCAT is functioning in the area of security for the refugee camps. We were also looking at how the United Nations is responding to some of these protection concerns that you raised, like rape. Another big issue that we were looking at is child recruitment and protection concerns for children. And again, in the camp,
You mean as child soldiers?
this is an issue, particularly in the camp Bahai that we visited. There's a rebel group called the GEM, which are supported by the Chadian government, that have a base close to the Sudanese border. And in Bahai, many of their children and many of their wives are actually refugees in the camp called Ori Kasoni. And so oftentimes you have armed men from GEM who are in the camp visiting their families, but they're also known to recruit children from within the camp. And so this is a big issue that we were looking at as well.
Right. And when you talk to the Darfuri refugees, what do they tell you? I mean, when do they think that they're going to go home? And under what circumstances would they go home?
Well, it's very interesting. The Darfuri refugees are quite tapped into what's going on in their home areas in Darfur. They have cell phone contact. They watch the news on TV. So they're following very closely things like Bashir's indictment, and they really are keeping up to date on the latest news. And many of them said to us that they're not ready to go home yet. They don't feel that it's safe in their home areas, and they're waiting for Bashir to be arrested. And once that happens, then they might consider going home.
Are they hopeful that he will ever be arrested?
I think they're hopeful. I think that they see things happening, but they're also frustrated, having lived in the camps for 5 years, which is why, again, we're pushing for assistance to start looking at more longer-term type activities. Because after 5 years in a refugee camp and possibly 5 to 10 years more, they would like to have more.
Okay, Camilla Olsen, thank you very much for joining us on the program, and good luck with your work.
Thank you.